There's a moment many people experience, often quietly, when they realize their fear of hell didn't start with personal evidence or clear reasoning, but from ideas planted long before they developed the ability to question them. It might surface late at night, or during a stressful moment, or even in an ordinary conversation when someone brings up eternity, punishment, or the afterlife. And whether or not the details match the story you were taught growing up, the emotional hook often feels the same, a deep, internal alarm telling you not to question, not to step out of line, and not to think too freely. That alarm is powerful, and it can follow people into adulthood long after they've stopped believing the rest of the story. Fear has a way of shaping behavior long after the source has faded. The concept of hell is one of the strongest examples we have of this. It's not just a place described in old texts. It becomes a psychological structure that attaches itself to thoughts about identity, morality, community, and even personal worth. And the more someone feels that emotional echo, the harder it becomes to step back and analyze where that fear came from and whether it ever deserved the authority it was given. The first step to overcoming the fear isn't to pretend it doesn't exist or dismiss it with a wave of the hand. It's acknowledging that the fear was built intentionally. That's not an accusation against any one group. It's simply an observable pattern in human culture. For thousands of years across countless societies, leaders have known that the threat of punishment after death is one of the strongest motivations humans respond to. It works because it bypasses logic and aims straight at survival instincts, the part of the brain that reacts to danger long before conscious thought shows up. When children are taught about eternal punishment, they're being asked to hold a concept far larger than their psychological development can process. A child can't evaluate doctrine, a child can't weigh evidence, a child can't analyze ancient languages or compare theological systems. But a child can feel fear, and once fear takes root that early, it doesn't feel like an idea. It feels like a truth, even when every other belief connected to it has faded or fallen apart. This is why many people who no longer believe in the religion they grew up with still carry a quiet sense of dread when the topic of hell comes up. They may roll their eyes at the imagery or reject the theology on an intellectual level, yet still feel a small wave of unease they can't fully explain. That unease isn't a sign that hell is real. It's a sign that the emotional circuits built during childhood still fire in adulthood, even when the beliefs that once triggered them have been re-evaluated. Understanding the psychology behind this fear is one of the strongest tools for breaking free from it. Researchers studying religious trauma and cognitive imprinting have consistently found that early exposure to fear-based doctrines leaves long-lasting emotional patterns. These patterns often operate without conscious awareness, influencing decisions, anxieties, and even physical stress responses. You're not irrational for feeling the fear, but once you know why that fear exists, you're no longer powerless against it. When we talk about hell, it's important to separate the emotional impact from the structure of the doctrine itself. Hell isn't a single idea. It's a collection of ideas that evolved over centuries. The version most people fear today isn't the version found in the earliest traditions. It's a later construction, shaped through politics, power struggles, and cultural tension. Early Jewish writings barely mention anything resembling the modern concept. Ancient Greek ideas shaped another layer. Medieval interpretations transformed it again. What many people fear now isn't even the version their ancestors would have understood. This matters because when a belief changes drastically over time, it tells us something important. It didn't arise from a direct observation of reality. It came from cultural storytelling, layered interpretations, and the human tendency to use fear to reinforce moral or social control. If hell were a measurable, objective aspect of existence, it wouldn't need centuries of revisions or reinterpretations. It would be stable, consistent, and universally recognizable across cultures. But that's not what we see. We see the opposite. We see doctrines shifting in response to political needs, philosophical trends, and social pressures. We see religious leaders redefining eternal punishment depending on what message they want their followers to absorb. We see communities debating whether hell is literal fire, symbolic separation, temporary purification, or permanent torment. And these debates aren't happening because new evidence is emerging. They're happening because the concept itself was never grounded in evidence to begin with. Yet despite all of this, the emotional weight of hell remains powerful. Not because the idea is logical, but because the fear attaches itself to parts of the mind that logic doesn't automatically reach. And this is why so many people struggle with the fear long after they've outgrown the belief system that introduced it. The fear feels separate from the belief, even though they were built together. One of the most effective ways to weaken that fear is to analyze how the doctrine functions socially. Fear-based teachings rely on isolation. They depend on the idea that questioning is dangerous. They grow stronger when people stop comparing beliefs across cultures and history. When you break that isolation, the fear begins to lose its foundation. Because once the idea of hell is placed Side by side with hundreds of other human-created stories about the afterlife, its uniqueness disappears. It becomes one of many myths designed to answer the same anxieties. And that brings us to a crucial point. Almost every civilization in history has developed some version of punitive afterlife imagery. They didn't all invent the same one. They didn't all describe the same horrors, but they all created something that served a similar purpose, a way to enforce moral behavior, maintain social order, or explain suffering. The fact that humans created so many different versions shows that people weren't discovering an unseen reality. They were reacting to the same psychological pressures. Those pressures often came from fear of the unknown, the unpredictability of life, and the desire for a system that rewards the good and punishes the cruel when reality fails to do so. In many ways, the invention of hell wasn't about truth. It was about control over chaos. It created a simple emotional equation: behave or suffer, conform or be destroyed, obey or be punished forever. This kind of narrative is extremely effective, especially when introduced young, because it gives people the illusion that the universe is morally organized even when evidence suggests otherwise. But once you recognize that almost every culture created its own version of post-death punishment, you begin to see a pattern. The pattern isn't divine revelation. It's human storytelling shaped by social needs. An understanding that pattern helps create distance between you and the fear attached to it. It becomes easier to see hell not as a lurking cosmic threat, but as one of many tools humans have used to influence behavior. Another way to loosen the grip of fear is to consider what the belief implies about the universe. The idea of eternal punishment assumes that existence is structured around retribution instead of growth, compassion, or learning. It suggests that one mistake, or even one wrong belief, could justify infinite suffering. When you look at the natural world, the psychological world, or the social world, you don't see anything that operates with that kind of logic. Consequences exist, of course, but they're not infinite or timeless. They're proportional, they're contextual, and they're tied to physical actions rather than thought crimes. The very concept of infinite punishment for finite actions breaks every principle we use to understand justice. It violates the idea that consequences should relate to the harm done. It contradicts what we know about human development, where behavior is shaped by environment, upbringing, and circumstance, and it collapses the idea that moral growth is possible. Eternity eliminates the possibility of change, making the universe a place where improvement doesn't matter, only obedience does. When people break down the logic of hell in this way, they often realize something important. The doctrine requires you to accept ideas that don't match how anything actually works. It demands a type of thinking that would be rejected in every other area of life. And once you see that, the emotional hold begins to loosen. The fear becomes less like an external force and more like a leftover reflex, something that made sense at one point in your life but no longer fits the reality you know. Another powerful step forward is examining how the fear of hell affects mental health. Studies in psychology have found that fear-based religious teachings are strongly correlated with anxiety disorders, intrusive thoughts, and chronic stress. This doesn't mean everyone who believes in hell suffers these issues, but for people who internalize the fear deeply, the effects can be long-lasting. The physical responses, racing heart, tight chest, spiraling thoughts, are not signs of spiritual danger. They're signs that the brain is responding to a threat that was never real but was treated as real for years. Understanding this can shift the meaning of the fear. Instead of interpreting the anxiety as evidence that something supernatural is warning you, you begin to see it as a conditioned response. The brain learned to react to certain ideas with alarm, and it continues doing that until the pattern is rewired. This is not a moral failure. It's not a lack of courage. It's simply how human minds work when fear is reinforced repeatedly from a young age. For many people, the shift from fear to freedom begins with allowing themselves to look directly at the mechanisms that created the fear. When you learn how fear-based doctrines are constructed, the emotional intensity decreases. When you understand how cognitive conditioning works, the lingering dread feels less mystifying. And when you examine how different cultures created different visions of the afterlife, the idea of hell loses its sense of inevitability. One of the most impactful realizations comes from understanding scale. The universe is nearly 14 billion years old, with trillions of stars and planets. The idea that this entire cosmos revolves around the moral decisions of one species on one planet, and that the primary concern of this cosmic structure is eternal punishment for minor offenses or incorrect beliefs, becomes increasingly implausible. The scale of existence simply does not match the narrowness of the doctrine. Even within philosophical discussions, the concept of hell creates contradictions. If a creator is omniscient, then they would have known in advance which beings would suffer eternally, making the punishment unavoidable and predetermined. If a creator is omnipotent, they could end the suffering instantly. If a creator is perfectly good, eternal torture cannot be reconciled with that goodness. These contradictions have been debated for centuries, not because they point to deeper truth, but because the doctrine itself forces people into logical corners that have no satisfying resolution. The contradictions grow even sharper when you look at how moral responsibility works. If someone commits harmful acts because of trauma, lack of education, or psychological issues, eternal punishment offers no path to healing or restoration. It treats moral failure as a fixed trait rather than a condition shaped by circumstance. Modern ethics, psychology, and sociology all recognize that people change when given support, understanding, and opportunity. Hell rejects all of that, offering only infinite retribution without context. When you place the doctrine next to the world we know, a world where people grow, change, and overcome their past, it becomes clear that eternal punishment reflects human anger far more than cosmic justice. It echoes the emotional impulses of fear, frustration, and the desire for control. And once you see that emotional origin, you gain the ability to step back from it. You no longer see hell as an external threat. You see it as something crafted from very human feelings. Another overlooked angle is how the fear of hell disconnects people from their own moral instincts. When morality is shaped by fear of punishment rather than empathy or understanding, it becomes performative. People begin to act good, not because they care about others, but because they fear consequences. True moral behavior comes from recognizing the impact of our actions on real people, not from fear of an invisible authority figure. Breaking free from the fear of hell often leads to a deeper, more grounded sense of morality. Instead of following rules to avoid punishment, people begin to act according to principles that improve the world around them. They develop a moral compass based on compassion rather than fear, and this shift can be life-changing, both for individuals and for the communities they help shape. As you continue to examine the origins of hell, its psychological effects, and the contradictions built into the doctrine, something subtle happens. The fear starts to separate from the idea itself. You begin to see the fear as a habit, not a warning, a reflex, not a prophecy, a remnant of a story that once felt all-encompassing, but now reveals itself to be one of many myths humans have created. The moment you recognize that the fear is a leftover reflex, the relationship to it changes. You no longer feel trapped inside it. You begin to look at it with curiosity instead of dread. That shift, subtle as it is, marks the beginning of real freedom, because fear relies on passivity. It needs you to feel overwhelmed, small, and unable to question. Once you start observing the fear itself, the fear loses its authority. Another powerful approach comes from looking directly at the cultural evolution of hell. In early Judaism, the afterlife was vague and mostly neutral. There was no eternal torture, no fiery realm overseen by a cosmic judge. It was a shadowy place where all the dead went, regardless of moral standing. The idea of eternal punishment only developed centuries later, influenced heavily by Persian dualism and Greek philosophical imagery. What many people fear today is a patchwork of imported concepts layered onto earlier traditions. Understanding that history changes the emotional landscape of the doctrine. Something that feels eternal and unchanging suddenly becomes a cultural invention shaped by politics, imperial influences, and shifting power structures. The fear begins to feel less like a cosmic truth and more like a social artifact. And artifacts, unlike divine laws, can be examined, questioned, and ultimately set down. One of the most striking examples of how adaptable the concept is comes from the Christian Middle Ages. During that period, hell became more vivid, more graphic, and more terrifying, not because new revelations were discovered, but because the church sought to reinforce social order during periods of instability. Sermons became filled with horrifying descriptions. Art depicted elaborate scenes of suffering. Plays dramatized eternal torment to warn audiences about straying from obedience. The fear served a political purpose, and the imagery expanded to match the need for control. When political tensions eased and cultural priorities shifted, the imagery softened. Different branches of the faith reinterpreted hell in symbolic or metaphorical ways. Some movements rejected eternal punishment entirely, and these changes had nothing to do with new evidence. They simply reflected what each era needed from the doctrine. Seeing how flexible the idea is helps dissolve its emotional grip. If a belief can be reshaped so easily by the priorities of the time, then it's not the kind of absolute truth that demands unquestioning obedience. It's a tool, and like any tool, it reflects the motives of the people using it. Many people find that the fear begins to fade when they compare hell to similar concepts from other cultures. The ancient Egyptians described a series of trials after death, with hearts weighed against a feather. The Greeks imagined Tartarus, a deep abyss where certain figures suffered endlessly. Norse mythology described realms of cold and emptiness for the dishonored dead. Indigenous cultures across the world developed their own visions of post-death punishment, each shaped by local values and environmental realities. None of these traditions were based on objective evidence. They were attempts to understand existence, maintain order, and answer emotional questions about justice. Once you see hell as one myth among many, its uniqueness evaporates. It becomes one more example of human storytelling rather than an indicator of cosmic danger. Another helpful perspective comes from developmental psychology. When children are exposed to threatening religious imagery, their brains imprint those ideas in regions associated with fear and emotional memory. Even if the beliefs change later, the emotional imprint can linger. This is why adults often experience a nagging sense of unease, even when they know intellectually that the doctrine no longer makes sense to them. Therapists working with religious trauma often describe a process where people gradually untangle their emotional responses from the beliefs that created them. The fear weakens when people learn to identify triggers, understand the origin of their anxiety, and consciously reframe the narrative. Over time, the conditioned response fades in the same way other childhood fears eventually dissolve. Another angle that helps many people is recognizing how incompatible the doctrine is with everything we know about consciousness. Neuroscience has shown that thoughts, feelings, and identity arise from the functioning of the brain. When the brain ceases, those processes cease. There's no evidence that consciousness survives death, let alone that it continues in a structured environment designed for eternal torment. The more we learn about how the mind works, the less space there is for the idea of post-mortem punishment. This doesn't provide absolute certainty. Nothing in science does. But it does show that the burden of proof lies entirely on those claiming that infinite torture awaits people after they die. And throughout history, that burden has never been met. The doctrine rests not on evidence, but on tradition and emotional influence. Another under-discussed point involves the moral implications of eternal punishment. If a system allows for infinite suffering, it cannot be considered just. Modern forms of justice focus on prevention, rehabilitation, and proportional consequences. Eternal torture ignores these principles entirely. It's punishment without context, without possibility of change, and without any consideration of why people make the choices they do. When people seriously examine this mismatch between what we know about morality and what the doctrine claims, they often find the fear weakening. The doctrine becomes less credible when examined through the lens of real-world ethics. Breaking the fear also involves recognizing the role of imagination. The images people fear, fire, darkness, screams, grotesque torment, are creations of the mind. They're vivid because they were described vividly. They feel real because they were painted with sensory detail. But none of these images are grounded in observation. They're the result of human creativity, not cosmic revelation. When you remind yourself that the imagery was created by people, not delivered by some external force, the emotional power begins to shrink, and the stories about it become easier to see as stories. The fear of hell often thrives on isolation, so sharing your experiences with others can be transformative. Many people discover that the fear they thought was unique to them is actually extremely common. They hear stories of others who overcame it, learned to understand it, and eventually stopped feeling its weight altogether. Knowing you're not alone weakens the fear because fear relies on secrecy. It relies on the belief that your anxiety signals something real. Hearing that others have felt the same fear and moved past it creates a new kind of confidence. As the fear continues to lose its authority, something else begins to grow in its place, a sense of freedom, grounded not in rebellion but in clarity. You begin to trust your own reasoning. You begin to see that morality comes from empathy, not obedience. You begin to understand that meaning doesn't need to be enforced with threats. It can be built through connection, curiosity, and the pursuit of knowledge. As clarity grows, the fear of hell starts to feel less like a shadow you can't escape, and more like a memory, something that belonged to a different stage of your life. And like any memory formed under stress, it can still echo occasionally, but it no longer dictates your worldview. You can acknowledge the echo without obeying it. That shift is subtle, but it's profoundly liberating. Another important step in dissolving the fear is looking at how religious authorities often use the doctrine strategically. Whenever a belief system claims that doubt itself is dangerous or punishable, that's a red flag. Genuine truth doesn't require threats to maintain itself. It doesn't depend on fear to keep people loyal. When a system tries to limit questions by invoking punishment, it reveals that its foundations are fragile. The doctrine of hell is one of the clearest examples of this pattern. It's often invoked whenever someone begins to question authority, or ask difficult questions, not because those questions are harmful, but because they can expose inconsistencies. The fear keeps people from examining the belief too closely. But once you notice that mechanism, the threat becomes easier to dismiss. It turns from a cosmic danger into a psychological tactic. Many people find relief when they start exploring how other traditions treat doubt, curiosity, and dissent. Some philosophies welcome questioning as a path to growth. Some belief systems even encourage skepticism as a tool for discovering deeper truths. The contrast reveals something important. Systems that rely on fear of punishment to maintain adherence usually do so because their claims can't withstand scrutiny. The fear of hell also loses strength when you recognize how inconsistent the doctrine is across different communities. In some traditions, hell is a literal place of fire. In others, it's an abstract metaphor. Some believe it's eternal, others believe it's temporary. Some think it's reserved for the worst individuals, while others believe almost everyone goes there except a small, chosen group. When a belief varies this much depending on geography or denomination, it's hard to treat it as absolute truth. If the specifics of eternal punishment change depending on where someone was born, that suggests the doctrine is cultural, not universal. It's shaped by tradition, not by evidence. And once you see that, the fear begins to feel arbitrary rather than inevitable. Another angle comes from examining personal identity. The fear of hell often convinces people that they're inherently flawed or deserving of punishment. This belief can damage self-image and create deep emotional wounds. But when you step back and look at the human experience, you see that moral behavior is shaped by countless factors: genetics, environment, trauma, education, opportunity. No one chooses their starting point. People grow, change, learn, and adapt. The idea that someone deserves infinite torment because of finite mistakes ignores everything we know about how humans develop. It replaces empathy with ultimatum and growth with punishment. When you compare the doctrine to real human complexity, it becomes clear that it oversimplifies everything: morality, psychology, circumstance, and intention. An oversimplification is not a sign of truth, it's a sign of storytelling. Many people also find strength by reflecting on the absence of evidence for hell. Despite the vivid imagery, no observation, experiment, or measurement has ever supported the existence of a place of eternal punishment. The idea persists purely through tradition and emotional influence. And when a belief depends entirely on inherited stories, rather than observable reality, its emotional grip weakens when examined closely. Neuroscience provides another powerful perspective. We now understand that fear pathways in the brain can be rewired through practice, exposure, and reframing. This means the fear of hell isn't permanent. It's not an unchangeable part of you. It's simply a learned response that can be unlearned. The more you expose yourself to rational analysis, supportive conversations, and new perspectives, the weaker the fear becomes. In many cases, the fear diminishes not through sudden realization, but through gradual shifts. You wake up one morning and notice that the thought of eternal punishment doesn't provoke the same intense reaction as before. You hear someone make a dramatic claim about hell and realize it no longer feels convincing. You catch yourself thinking about the doctrine as a cultural artifact rather than a looming threat. Each of these moments is a marker of progress. Another helpful exercise is examining what motivates your moral choices. If your ethics come from empathy, compassion, and a desire to reduce harm, then they're grounded in something real and human. Fear-based morality, on the other hand, is fragile. It collapses when the fear fades. But morality based on genuine concern for others persists regardless of belief systems. Recognizing this helps untangle your identity from fear-based teachings. People often discover that once the fear of hell fades, their moral clarity actually improves. They become more thoughtful, more attentive to consequences, and more aware of how their actions affect others. Without the pressure of eternal punishment, they make choices based on understanding rather than obedience, and this leads to a more grounded and meaningful sense of responsibility. Another liberating realization is that the fear of hell thrives in uncertainty, specifically the uncertainty surrounding death. Humans have always struggled with not knowing what happens after we die. This anxiety opens the door for dramatic explanations, especially those that offer a sense of order or cosmic justice. But not knowing doesn't justify fear-based stories. It simply highlights the limits of our knowledge. Once you accept uncertainty as a natural part of existence, the need for rigid narratives diminishes. You don't have to fill every unknown with a frightening answer. You can leave space for mystery without resorting to punishment-based explanations, and that ability to tolerate uncertainty is a key part of emotional maturity. People sometimes worry that letting go of the fear of hell means losing connection to their past or abandoning loved ones who still believe. But overcoming fear doesn't require rejecting your history. It means reinterpreting it with compassion and clarity. You can acknowledge that the people who taught you these beliefs were passing along what they thought was true. You can appreciate their intentions without inheriting their fears. This perspective allows you to hold your past gently instead of struggling against it. You're not betraying anyone by freeing yourself from fear. You're simply choosing a healthier, more grounded relationship with your own mind. As the fear continues to dissolve, you begin to notice its absence. Thoughts that once triggered anxiety now feel neutral. Conversations that once caused tension now pass without emotional weight. The doctrine loses its sharpness and becomes something distant, almost unfamiliar. This shift feels like stepping out of a confined space into open air. It's subtle but unmistakable. You begin to trust yourself, your reasoning, your observations, your inner sense of right and wrong. And trust in yourself is the antidote to fear that was designed to override independent thinking. Once that trust takes root, fear has nowhere left to anchor itself. As trust in your own reasoning grows, the emotional power of old doctrines continues to fade. You no longer feel pulled back into the mental loops that used to keep you anxious. Instead, you start observing those loops with a kind of calm detachment. You see how they formed, how they operated, and why they felt so intense. And once you understand the mechanism, its influence weakens even further. One of the most empowering realizations is that fear-based doctrines depend on your imagination cooperating with them. They rely on vivid mental imagery and emotional storytelling. Without imaginative reinforcement, the threat loses definition. You begin to notice that the fear doesn't come from an external force. It comes from mental pictures that were planted years ago, and when you stop feeding those pictures, they slowly dissolve. Another angle that helps dissolve fear is reflecting on the sheer inconsistency of eternal punishment across religious history. Early concepts of divine justice were tied to tribal survival, not universal truth. Spiritual leaders crafted beliefs that reinforced social unity, discouraged betrayal, and maintained order within small communities. These early ideas later evolved into grand metaphysical systems, but their origin was practical, not cosmic. When beliefs about the afterlife expand from local needs into universal claims, contradictions naturally multiply. You end up with doctrines that clash with modern ethics, scientific understanding, and basic principles of fairness. And when you analyze those contradictions instead of trying to resolve them, the idea of eternal punishment appears less like a profound truth and more like a relic of a different era. People often find relief when they explore how moral systems can function independently of religious frameworks. Anthropologists have documented intricate ethical codes in societies with no concept of heaven or hell. Morality existed long before organized religion, shaped by cooperation, empathy, and the need to thrive together. Humans evolved as social creatures, and our instincts for fairness and reciprocity developed long before written doctrines. This reinforces an important point. Morality doesn't depend on fear of punishment. It emerges from our nature as beings who survive through cooperation. When you understand that your moral instincts are rooted in something deeper and more ancient than doctrine, the idea of needing threats to behave well becomes unnecessary. That realization dissolves another layer of the fear. One of the most overlooked aspects of fear-based doctrines is how they distort human self-worth. When people grow up hearing that they're inherently flawed or deserving of punishment, it shapes their sense of identity. They may internalize guilt and shame long after leaving the belief system. But when you compare this with modern psychological understanding, the doctrine's claims don't hold up. People aren't born fundamentally broken. They're shaped by environment, experience, biology, and relationships. The doctrine oversimplifies humanity to maintain control, not to promote truth. Understanding this allows you to reclaim your sense of value. You start viewing yourself not as someone who escaped punishment, but as someone who outgrew a harmful narrative. You no longer interpret your emotional responses as signs of spiritual danger, but as echoes of conditioning that can be rewired. Another powerful source of clarity comes from recognizing how much the doctrine of hell relies on fear rather than evidence. If eternal punishment were a real aspect of the universe, we would expect to see consistent descriptions across cultures, reliable experiences, and measurable effects. Instead, we see widely varying stories shaped by geography, historical context, and theological conflict. That variation suggests human invention, not cosmic reality. The absence of evidence doesn't prove anything conclusively, but it does shift the burden of proof. Those who claim that infinite suffering awaits people after death carry the responsibility of demonstrating it. Yet throughout history, no one has done so. They've only passed along inherited tradition. The doctrine's reliance on inherited fear becomes clearer when you consider how often it appears in contexts of control. It's used to discourage disobedience, suppress dissent, and enforce loyalty. When belief systems threaten eternal suffering for questioning, it's a sign that the beliefs can't stand on their own merits. And once you recognize that pattern, it becomes easier to step outside of it. Many people find freedom when they start exploring alternative ways of thinking about death. Instead of filling the unknown with fear, they allow themselves to sit with uncertainty. They realize that uncertainty doesn't have to be frightening. It can be a space for curiosity, reflection, and peace. The unknown doesn't need to be populated with punishment. It can simply remain unknown. This shift often leads to a more grounded relationship with life itself. Without the pressure of eternal consequences, people begin to appreciate the present moment more deeply. They become more aware of their actions because those actions matter here, not in some imagined afterlife. This awareness leads to a more authentic sense of responsibility, one that isn't driven by fear but by genuine care for the world and the people in it. Another important step in overcoming fear is examining how fear-based teachings shape emotional responses. The mind tends to react strongly to vivid, intense imagery, especially imagery learned early in life. But as you analyze the structure of those images, they lose potency. You realize that fire, darkness, and suffering were used because they trigger primal responses. They bypass reasoning and latch onto instinct. But once you understand that these images were chosen strategically, they stop feeling like warnings and start feeling like tools. And tools can be put down once you're aware of them. As the fear weakens, your ability to reflect calmly increases. You start noticing how often the old reflexes appear, and each time you acknowledge them without obeying them, the neural pathways responsible for the fear grow weaker. This is how the mind heals, not through sudden insight, but through repeated experiences that prove the fear is no longer necessary. Over time, people often report that the idea of hell starts to feel distant and unreal, not because they force themselves to stop thinking about it, but because it no longer fits their understanding of the universe, morality, or themselves. It becomes a story they once believed, not a threat they still carry. And this transformation doesn't require rejecting anyone or anything. It simply requires allowing yourself to think clearly, feel honestly, and trust your ability to understand your own experience. Fear shrinks when confronted with clarity. It fades when no longer reinforced, and eventually it becomes something you can look back on without feeling trapped by it. You begin to see your own agency, your ability to interpret ideas, evaluate evidence, and shape your worldview. And when you reclaim that agency, fear loses the power it once held. You start to realize something important. Fear that is learned can also be unlearned, and fear that is repeated into you can eventually be replaced by understanding that comes from you. The moment that shift begins, the entire emotional landscape around the idea of hell starts to lose its sharp edges. You begin responding to it the way you'd respond to any outdated threat that no longer fits the world you live in, like an old alarm that keeps going off even though the danger it warns about isn't real. And once you start looking at hell as a claim instead of a danger, something else opens up. You notice how inconsistent the threat has always been, how different groups describe hell in wildly different ways, how even within the same tradition, the details shift from teacher to teacher. And you think, if the destination were real, shouldn't the maps at least agree? This lack of agreement matters more than most people realize, because fear usually requires certainty. A threat has to feel clear and specific for it to trigger lasting anxiety. But when you step back and actually inspect the descriptions of hell, the clarity dissolves. Some say it's fire, some say it's darkness, some say it's temporary, some say eternal, some say it's a literal place, others say it's metaphorical. And when a threat can't decide what it is, it becomes harder for your mind to treat it as credible. You also begin noticing how the fear of hell tends to appear in people who hear about it early in life, long before they have the ability to question sources, analyze motives, or evaluate claims. And that alone shows something important. If hell were a real danger, you wouldn't need to introduce it to children for it to stick. Adults would encounter the evidence on their own. They'd observe signs, patterns, or events that point toward it. But in reality, the fear only shows up through teaching, and often through environments that encourage obedience before curiosity. This is why that fear can feel so deep. It grew inside you before you had the tools to resist it. But that doesn't make it true. It only makes it familiar. And sometimes familiarity disguises itself as truth because it feels like part of your identity. Yet identity can evolve. It can upgrade. It can shed beliefs that no longer serve you. Another shift happens when you look at the psychology of fear-based systems. Researchers studying high-control groups, authoritarian institutions, and punitive cultures notice the same pattern. Threats about punishment after death show up when leaders want to maintain control without needing physical force. A fear you carry inside yourself is far more efficient than any external rule, because you become your own enforcer. Understanding this doesn't just weaken the fear. It can feel like reclaiming something, like recovering a part of your mind that was lent out for too long. And the moment you recognize how psychological mechanisms are used, the emotional weight of hell starts to detach from you. Slowly at first, then faster. You might notice yourself responding differently to old thoughts. Instead of panic, you feel curiosity. Instead of urgency, you feel distance. Instead of guilt, you feel something closer to clarity. And this is where many people experience a surprising turning point. They start examining not just the belief in hell, but the logic behind tying eternal punishment to finite human choices. When you think about that structure, it becomes hard to treat it as a coherent system. Eternal consequences for temporary actions don't align with any known principle of fairness. Not in law, not in ethics, not in everyday life. The proportionality is missing. The justification is missing. The mechanism is missing. And the more you evaluate the claim with the same standards you apply to everything else, medicine, science, history, evidence, the more you see how poorly the idea of hell holds up under examination. If someone made a claim of infinite danger in any other area of life, you'd expect overwhelming proof, not tradition, not emotional pressure, not inherited stories. This is why many people discover that their fear fades in direct proportion to their willingness to question the foundation of the belief. When the structure beneath a fear weakens, the fear collapses with surprising speed. But something even deeper happens next. At some point, people realize that fear of hell is not actually rooted in logic at all. It's rooted in attachment to the version of themselves that once trusted the idea, attachment to people who reinforced it, attachment to a worldview that seemed stable because it had answers for everything, even if those answers were untested. Disentangling yourself from that attachment doesn't mean rejecting your past. It means updating your relationship to it, understanding where the fear came from, why it worked, and why it no longer fits the person you're becoming. As you move through that process, the fear shifts from a threat to a memory. You stop responding to it emotionally and start recognizing it intellectually. It becomes something you can examine calmly, almost like analyzing an old superstition. And that sense of calm is the clearest sign that the fear is losing its grip. And once that happens, a new kind of freedom shows up. Not the loud, dramatic kind, but the quiet, steady freedom that comes from knowing your thoughts are actually your own. That sense of freedom grows slowly, almost unnoticed at first. You go through your day and realize that certain thoughts that once triggered stress now feel neutral. The old background tension is quieter. The intrusive questions have less force behind them. It's like your mind is adjusting to a new internal climate, one that isn't shaped by fear, but by understanding. And understanding tends to reshape everything it touches. As that continues, you begin exploring something deeper. You start questioning not only the fear of hell, but the framework that made the fear seem necessary. Many people discover that the threat of hell operates like a safety net for shaky beliefs. It fills in gaps, compensates for missing evidence, and discourages people from noticing contradictions. Because if you're told that doubt is dangerous, you'll avoid examining what might not hold up under scrutiny. Once you see that pattern, it becomes obvious that the fear doesn't function as protection. It functions as restriction. It limits what questions you feel allowed to ask, what conclusions you feel allowed to reach, what parts of reality you feel allowed to explore. And the moment you lift that restriction, you start to notice how wide the world actually is. You also begin recognizing how fear shapes memory, how a single frightening idea introduced early can attach itself to unrelated moments for years afterward, and how your mind, trying to protect you, sometimes rehearses the fear even without external triggers. This isn't a sign that the fear is valid. It's a sign that fear is persistent because the brain treats emotional threats with high priority, especially threats with no clear solution. That persistence doesn't make it permanent. It just means the brain is doing what it evolved to do, respond strongly to warnings, even when the warnings come from stories rather than reality. And when you understand that mechanism, the fear begins to feel less like a personal flaw and more like an outdated instinct responding to outdated information. Another thing becomes clear as you look deeper. The idea of hell has never been applied consistently to human behavior. Throughout history, the definition of what leads to punishment has shifted countless times. Behaviors once labeled sinful are now normal. Beliefs once mandatory are now optional. Even moral rules have changed based on culture, geography, and political power. A real universal danger wouldn't fluctuate based on location or leadership. The rules around gravity don't depend on which country you're born in, but the rules around hell do. And that inconsistency makes the claim feel more like a cultural construction than a cosmic truth. You might start noticing how the idea of eternal damnation creates emotional dependence. If you're told that safety exists only within a specific belief system, then leaving believing it feels like stepping into danger, even if there's no evidence of that danger. This is how fear can masquerade as loyalty, how anxiety can disguise itself as faithfulness. When people finally acknowledge that emotional dependence, something shifts. They stop interpreting the fear as a sign that the belief is true and start seeing it as a sign that the belief was implanted with strong psychological leverage. And psychological leverage fades once it's recognized. Then something else emerges. People begin asking themselves a simple question they never allowed before. What if the fear is a leftover from someone else's anxiety, a passed-down worry, a generational echo, a burden inherited rather than chosen? When you view it that way, the fear starts to feel external rather than internal, something placed on you rather than something coming from within you, and anything that was placed on you can eventually be removed from you. You might also begin learning about how ancient cultures understood the afterlife, how many early societies had no concept of eternal torment at all, how earlier traditions described the afterlife in neutral or even peaceful terms, how the idea of endless punishment emerged gradually, influenced by politics, literature, and shifts in social control. Seeing that development creates distance, it breaks the illusion that the concept has always existed in its current form, and that distance is one of the most powerful tools for dissolving fear. Because once a belief has a history, it stops feeling like an unchangeable fact and starts feeling like a human creation. Another insight appears when you examine the emotional tone of the doctrine itself. Fear-based systems often rely on worst-case scenarios to maintain influence. But worst-case scenarios aren't reliable indicators of truth. They're indicators of persuasion tactics. Every area of life has people claiming catastrophic consequences for failing to follow their specific rules. But those claims are only compelling until you test them. And that's another critical moment in the process, when you realize you've never actually tested the belief. You accepted it because you were expected to accept it, and the fear persisted because the fear was reinforced long before evidence was ever discussed. Testing the belief doesn't mean proving anything dramatic. It simply means subjecting the idea of hell to the same standards you use for every other extraordinary claim. And when you do that, the belief loses its special status. It stops being exempt from scrutiny. Once it loses that exemption, the fear loses its fuel, and a belief without fuel can't sustain itself. This is where many people feel themselves crossing an invisible threshold. The fear stops being a force that pushes you and becomes a topic you can observe calmly from the outside. And with that calm comes something you might not expect, a growing confidence in your own ability to think clearly, to trust your reasoning, to evaluate claims on your own terms, even when those claims once held enormous emotional power. As that confidence settles in, you realize something subtle but powerful. The fear that once felt like an unavoidable part of your inner world is now something you can look at without flinching, without tension in your chest, without that sense of urgency that once made the thought of hell feel like a shadow following you everywhere. The shadow is still there in memory, but it's no longer attached to your sense of reality. You start noticing how your mind recalibrates, how thoughts that once triggered panic now pass through without sticking, how old ideas show up but don't grip you, how your emotional reflexes slowly align with what you now know instead of what you were once told. And that alignment is one of the clearest signs that your relationship to fear has changed at the root, not just on the surface. The more you pay attention, the more you recognize a simple truth. Fear doesn't disappear because you force it out. It dissolves when you shine enough clarity on the thing you were taught to fear. Clarity removes the mystery. Mystery removes the imagined danger. And once the imagined danger fades, the fear that depended on it fades with it. Some people worry that letting go of the fear of hell will leave them directionless. But the opposite tends to happen. When fear is no longer the framework for your decisions, you start building a healthier moral compass, one based on empathy rather than punishment, on consequences you can observe rather than consequences you were threatened with, on the real world rather than an invisible one used to enforce compliance. And that shift brings something most people don't expect, a deeper sense of responsibility, not a weaker one, because now your actions matter for human reasons, not supernatural ones. You care about how you affect others because that impact is immediate, tangible, measurable, not because you're worried about cosmic surveillance or eternal judgment. In that space, morality becomes more honest, kindness becomes more deliberate, integrity becomes more meaningful, compassion becomes more grounded, and the absence of fear makes room for something far more stable, a sense of agency, the sense that your decisions are yours, guided by clarity rather than dread. As you look back on the old fear, you notice how disproportionate it was, how the threat of eternal punishment made ordinary doubts feel dangerous, how it magnified small mistakes into imagined catastrophes, how it controlled your attention more than your behavior, how it shaped your emotions more than your choices, and how distant those patterns feel now that you've stepped outside them. There's a moment many people reach where they can think about hell the way they think about any myth, not with dismissal, not with mockery, but with understanding that stories can shape people powerfully, especially when introduced before a person can evaluate them. Understanding that fear can attach itself easily when it has been repeated for years. An understanding that beliefs can be unlearned without rejecting every part of who you once were. You can hold your past gently without letting it define your future. You can acknowledge that the fear once felt real without pretending that it was justified. You can recognize that the belief once made sense to you without letting it control you, and that balance, respect without submission, memory without obedience, is what emotional freedom looks like. And eventually, the idea of hell loses the last of its power. It becomes a concept you can discuss without anxiety, something you can analyze, reference, even joke about lightly in your own mind without feeling the old pull. The concept shrinks until it fits into the same category as any other unsupported claim. An idea, not a threat, a story, not a destination. What replaces the fear isn't rebellion or defiance. It's something quieter, a steady sense of grounding, a calm orientation toward reality, an internal voice that no longer panics at the sound of old warnings because it finally understands where those warnings came from and why they were so effective. You reach a point where you can feel the difference directly. The absence of dread isn't empty, it's spacious. It gives you room to think, room to grow, room to choose, room to build a life not shaped by fear of where you might end up after death, but shaped by what you can do with the time you actually have. And that is the moment you realize you've escaped something far larger than a belief. You've escaped a system of fear that once lived inside you, a system that felt permanent because it was planted early, repeated often, and left unchallenged for too long. But once you finally examined it with your own eyes, its walls dissolved, the gates opened, and the exit was there all along. You didn't escape by running, you escaped by understanding. And once you understand, the fear loses the only thing that ever made it powerful, your belief in it. And now, without that belief, without that weight, without that inherited dread, you can finally breathe in a way that feels honest, steady, unburdened. You've stepped out of the inferno you were taught to fear, not by fighting it, but by realizing it was never real, and nothing is more freeing than that.